In 1854, a single photograph stunned a quiet New York town. Two brothers, Elias and Samuel Granger, sat side by side in their Sunday best, yet the earth had already closed over them. This was no ordinary family picture. It was taken after death itself had been sheeted. Stay with us as we uncover their haunting story. And if you love true tales of forgotten American history, be sure to like, share, subscribe, and hit the bell icon. The photograph looks ordinary at first glance. Two boys sit side by side in wooden chairs, their small bodies dressed neatly in stiff, formal Sunday clothes. The collars are high, the buttons polished, the hair combed flat against pale foreheads. A traveling photographer, like many who moved through rural towns in the 1850s, had arranged the scene with care. At first, it seems like a simple family portrait, the kind any parent of the time would want to keep. But then, as the eye lingers, the truth becomes clear. The faces of the boys are too still, too heavy. Their hands, folded in their laps, are not resting but placed. And their eyes are closed. The inscription on the back of the photograph is even more unsettling. Elias and Samuel Granger, taken after the earth closed, 1854. This single line has puzzled generations of historians, collectors, and descendants alike. What could it mean that a picture was taken after the earth had closed? The words suggest a burial, a final laying to rest. Yet here they are, seated as though alive, captured forever in silver and glass. For many, the photograph has become one of the most haunting relics of mid-19th century America. It is more than just a family memento. It is a window into a moment of deep sorrow, fear, and mystery. The story of Elias and Samuel Granger begins not in the darkness of a photographer's parlor, but in the everyday rhythms of a farming family in upstate New York. They were ordinary children of an ordinary household. Yet their fate would become extraordinary, marked by tragedy that speaks to the fragile line between life and death in a time before modern medicine. In 1854, death was no stranger in American homes. Disease swept through towns with little warning. The sound of a cough in the night could quickly become the silence of a grave by morning. Families lived with an awareness that life was uncertain and brief. Still, when death struck the Granger household, it carried with it a cruel twist, one that left the family haunted and the town whispering for decades to come. When the photograph was rediscovered many years later in a box of old family relics, it reignited curiosity and dread. Why would parents commission such a picture? And what did the cryptic phrase, "after the earth closed," truly mean? To answer that question, we must look closely at the world of the mid-1800s, a world of epidemics, superstition, and fear of premature burial, a world where the boundary between life and death was thinner than we can imagine today. And we must step into the lives of two young brothers, whose bond was so close that even death seemed unable to separate them. The story that unfolds is not for the faint of heart. It is a story of grief, of desperate mistakes, of the human need to remember even when memory itself becomes unbearable. It is the story of how one family tried to hold on to what the earth had already claimed, and how the photograph they left behind continues to speak, even in silence. The Grangers never intended for their family's sorrow to become a tale told generations later. Yet here we are, more than a century and a half removed, staring at the faded image of Elias and Samuel, trying to understand what happened in that fateful autumn of 1854. The photograph, once meant for private mourning, has become a haunting piece of public history. And behind it lies a mystery that forces us to confront the fears and realities of life in 19th century America. This is where our journey begins. With two brothers who should have remained safe in memory, but instead became the centerpiece of a story about life, death, and the thin line that separated them. To understand the haunting photograph of Elias and Samuel Granger, We must first step back into the world they once lived in, before the tragedy, before the graves, before the camera froze their still faces in silver and glass. The year was 1854. America was a nation restless with change. Railroads were stretching across the countryside, linking once isolated communities to bustling markets. Telegraph lines carried messages faster than any rider on horseback could ever travel. Yet in many towns, especially in rural New York, life remained much the same as it had for generations, tied to the land, to the seasons, and to the rhythms of family and faith. The Grangers lived in a modest farmhouse set upon a patchwork of fields just outside a small village in the Mohawk Valley. It was not grand, not wealthy, but comfortable in its own way. A whitewashed house with peeling paint, a narrow chimney that sent smoke into the gray sky, and a sagging barn where animals huddled against the cold. Life here demanded long days and strong hands, but it also carried a sense of belonging to the soil, to neighbors, and to each other. The father, John Granger, was a farmer of steady reputation. He rose before dawn, pulling on boots still damp with dew, and worked the fields until his back ached. Corn, wheat, and hay filled his days, while livestock provided the family's milk and meat. He was not a man of wealth, but he was respected for his honesty and hard labor. His hands were calloused, his face lined by weather, but he carried himself with the quiet pride of a man providing for his own. His wife, Margaret, kept the household alive in ways that went beyond bread and broth. She spun wool, churned butter, mended clothes, and tended the small herb garden that supplied both flavor for meals and remedies for illness. She carried the burden of care, not only for her husband and children, but for the neighbors who often came seeking her poultices and teas when fever struck. Margaret was known as gentle but firm, with the kind of steady faith that kept a family anchored during hard times. And then there were the children. The Grangers had 5 in total, though 2 were taken by illness in infancy, an all too common grief in those years. By 1854, only 3 remained: Elias, Samuel, and their younger sister, Anna. Elias, at 12 years old, was on the edge of boyhood and the first steps into manhood. Tall for his age, with a lean frame hardened by chores, he bore the seriousness of someone older. He followed his father into the fields with pride, eager to learn the rhythms of planting and harvest. Yet despite his quiet, thoughtful nature, he carried a spark of curiosity that made him restless. He asked questions about everything: why the seasons changed, why thunder shook the sky, why God allowed sickness to strike good people. His father sometimes frowned at these questions, but his mother quietly encouraged them. Samuel, 3 years younger at 9, was different in every way. Shorter, round-faced, with a laugh that could ripple through a room, Samuel was known for mischief. He often followed Elias like a shadow, tugging at his brother's patience with endless chatter. If Elias was the thinker, Samuel was the doer, the boy who climbed trees, waded into streams barefoot, and dared friends to race him across the fields. Where Elias's eyes were thoughtful, Samuel's sparkled with mischief. But beneath their differences lay an unbreakable bond. They were inseparable, one rarely seen without the other. Little Anna, only 5, adored her brothers. She would sit on the wooden fence, watching them work and play, her small hands clapping when they wrestled or raced. For her, the boys were giants' protectors, playmates, and heroes all in one. She never imagined that one day their absence would leave her world unbearably silent. The Grangers. Life was built on routine. Sundays were for church, where the family filled a narrow pew in the village chapel. Hymns rose into the rafters, mingling with the sound of boots on wooden floors and whispers of prayers. Weekdays were for labor: John in the fields, Margaret in the home, Elias and Samuel helping wherever hands were needed. Nights were spent by lamplight, the glow of tallow candles flickering as Margaret read aloud from the Bible while John smoked his pipe in the corner. There was hardship, of course. Winters were long and food often scarce. A poor harvest could mean hunger, and illness always lurked near. But there was also joy. Barn dances in summer, the laughter of neighbors gathered for quilting bees, and evenings when Elias would whittle wood by the fire while Samuel told stories so wild that even Anna giggled until her sides hurt Dot. This was the world. The Granger boys knew a world of simplicity, faith, and family. It was not remarkable to anyone else, but to them, it was everything. And perhaps that is what makes their story so painful. They were not destined for greatness, nor tragedy. They were ordinary children in an ordinary home. Yet it was precisely in such homes that death so often struck in the mid-19th century, changing the course of families forever. The Grangers could not know it then, but the fragile peace of their home would soon be shattered by a sickness that swept silently through their town. And in its wake, two young brothers would become the center of one of the most chilling tragedies the village had ever seen. The first signs of trouble were small. A neighbor's child, only 6, was laid up with a fever one chilly September evening. Folks thought little of it at first. Children fell sick often in the mid-19th century, and most recovered with rest, warm broth, and the steady hand of a praying mother. But within days, whispers began to drift across the fields. The sickness was spreading. It started with a burning heat in the body, followed by weakness so deep a child could barely lift their head from the pillow. Then came the rasping coughs, the labored breaths, the sudden silence that told everyone in the room that death had arrived before dawn. Doctors in 1854 had little to offer. Medicine was primitive, treatments often more harmful than helpful. Some prescribed bleeding or purging. Others relied on tinctures and tonics that soothed but did not cure. There were no antibiotics, no modern vaccines, no hospitals as we know them today. Illness swept through towns like fire through dry grass, taking children first, and often taking them quickly. When the fever struck the Granger household, it did not come gently. One autumn night, Samuel woke with chills, his small body trembling under the quilt. His mother, Margaret, pressed her hand to his forehead and felt the unmistakable heat. By morning, his face was pale and damp with sweat. His laughter, so constant in the house, was replaced with a weak whimper. John hitched the wagon and rode into town to fetch the doctor. The physician, a weary man who had already seen too much death that month, examined Samuel with a grave expression. "Rest," he advised. "Plenty of fluids. Pray." That was all he could say. In truth, the doctor had watched too many families bury their young to offer much hope. It seemed Samuel might rally. But then Elias began coughing, a dry, wrenching sound that shook his thin frame. He tried to wave it off, insisting he was fine. But within hours, he too was burning with fever, his energy drained, his eyes dull. Margaret refused to leave their sides. She sat between their beds, cool cloths in her hands, whispering prayers until her lips cracked. She begged God to spare them, to trade her life for theirs. John, strong and stoic, hid his own fear in silence. But when he stepped outside into the night air, neighbors heard the sound of his weeping carried on the wind. The illness showed no mercy. Within 3 days, Samuel's breathing grew shallow. His chest rose and fell as if weighted down by stones. Elias, too, grew weaker, his once restless mind now dulled by fever's haze. The doctor returned, shook his head, and left without promise. The Grangers called for the minister. By the time he arrived, Samuel no longer stirred when his mother touched his cheek. Elias, moments later, followed him into silence. 2 boys, brothers who had been inseparable in life, now lay still within the same hour. The grief was crushing. Margaret collapsed at their bedside, clutching their hands as if holding on could anchor them to this world. John, who had endured backbreaking labor his whole life without complaint, now bent under the weight of sorrow heavier than any plow. Little Anna clung to her mother's skirts, too young to fully grasp what had happened, but old enough to understand that laughter would never fill their house the same way again. In the 1850s, death did not wait. There were no funeral homes, no long delays. The dead were prepared quickly, for the fear of decay was strong, and burial followed within a day or two. The boys were dressed in their finest, Elias in a stiff white shirt, Samuel in a hand-sewn vest, and placed in small coffins lined with cloth. Neighbors gathered in the farmhouse parlor. They sang hymns through trembling voices, the familiar words of "Shall we gather at the river?" carrying both comfort and sorrow. Then the procession made its way to the churchyard, where freshly dug earth waited to receive the brothers. The autumn wind blew cold, rattling the leaves as the coffins were lowered. The ground closed over Elias and Samuel Granger that day, sealing the grief of a family into the soil of the village. John placed his hand on the mound of earth, as if pressing down his heartbreak. Margaret, pale and hollow-eyed, whispered prayers into the wind, words lost in the rustle of trees. For the Grangers, life seemed to stop. 2 chairs sat empty at the table. The sound of boys' footsteps no longer echoed across the floorboards. Their absence was everywhere felt in the silence after supper, in the quiet fields, in the empty space beside Anna's crib. Yet, as the days passed, whispers began to stir. Some in the town had doubts. The sickness had taken many, yes, but there was something strange in the boys' deaths. Too sudden, some said, too quick. And in the dark hours of the night, Margaret herself began to wonder. Had her sons truly been gone when the coffins were closed? Or had the earth claimed them too soon? In the weeks after Elias and Samuel were laid to rest, grief weighed heavily on the Granger household. But beneath the sorrow ran something else, an unease that neither John nor Margaret could silence. It began as a whisper in the mind, a quiet doubt that grew louder with each passing day. Were the boys truly gone when the earth closed over them? This was not an uncommon fear in 1854. In fact, it haunted nearly every American family. Premature burial, the thought of being placed in the ground while still alive, was one of the greatest terrors of the 19th century. Newspapers printed stories that chilled readers. Coffins reopened only to reveal fingernail scratches on the inside lid, bodies twisted in unnatural positions, faces frozen in expressions of panic. Some reports were exaggerated, even sensational, but enough were true to feed the collective dread. Medicine of the time offered little certainty. Doctors often declared death when the heart slowed or the breath grew shallow, yet faint pulses and trance-like states could easily be mistaken for the end of life. Families sometimes kept vigil for days, watching for the faintest stir in a hand or chest before burial. Others demanded safety coffins, curious contraptions fitted with bells or air tubes so the buried could signal if they awoke beneath the earth. In cities like New York and Boston, entire societies were formed to study premature burial and prevent its horrors. In small towns, fear was quieter, but no less real. Villagers told stories by lamplight of people who had clawed their way back from the grave. Ministers preached of souls trapped between this world and the next. Mothers, especially those who had lost children, sometimes dreamed they heard scratching at their doors or faint cries in the night. For Margaret Granger, such fears took root quickly. She replayed the boy's final hours in her mind. Samuel had lain so still, but had his chest truly ceased rising? Elias's face had been pale, but hadn't she felt the faintest warmth in his hand when she kissed it goodbye? She tried to dismiss the doubts, yet they gnawed at her heart. Every time she looked toward the churchyard from the kitchen window, her stomach turned with dread. John, too, wrestled with unease. Though less prone to imagination than his wife, he had heard the whispers in town. One neighbor swore that Elias had coughed faintly as the coffin lid was closed. Another claimed she saw Samuel's fingers during the service. Perhaps it was grief playing tricks, but the story spread like smoke on the wind. The townsfolk began to murmur, shaking their heads, wondering if the Granger boys had been buried before their time. It was not. Long before the minister himself approached John. In a hushed voice, he admitted his own doubts, confessing that death often came so suddenly in cases of fever that mistakes could not be ruled out. He urged John to find peace in prayer, but his words did little to ease the torment. At night, Margaret would jolt awake, her dreams filled with visions of her sons trapped in darkness, calling out for her. She imagined their hands pressed against the coffin lid, their small fists pounding, their voices muffled by the heavy soil above them. Each morning she rose with hollow eyes, her heart torn by the possibility that she had abandoned them when they needed her most. The weight of doubt grew unbearable. Finally, the Grangers could no longer silence the whispers. They resolved to do what few dared to admit aloud, to have the boys' coffins reopened. It was a decision born not of curiosity, but of desperation. To live with the possibility that Elias and Samuel had been buried alive was worse than the certainty of death itself. Better, John told Margaret, to face the truth, however terrible, than to spend a lifetime haunted by unanswered questions. And so, arrangements were quietly made. On a gray October morning, just weeks after the burial, the Granger family, the minister, and a small gathering of uneasy neighbors made their way back to the churchyard. The shovels struck earth, the soil was lifted once more, and the coffins that had been sealed in grief were brought back into the light. What they found inside would sear itself into memory and mark the Grangers forever. The October sky was low and gray as the villagers gathered in the churchyard. Cold mist clung to the grass, and the only sound was the scrape of shovels biting into damp soil. It was a grim sight, men digging up graves that had only recently been filled, women clutching shawls tighter around their shoulders, children kept at a distance, but still peering curiously from behind fence posts. The Granger stood silently at the edge of the plot. John's jaw was clenched, his hands fisted at his sides. Margaret's face was pale, her eyes red from nights without sleep. Little Anna pressed against her mother's skirt, too young to understand, but sensing the tension in every adult around her. As the earth was cleared away, the men shifted uneasily. Some muttered prayers. Others avoided looking at the Grangers, ashamed to be disturbing the rest of children. But no one spoke against it. The whispers in town had grown too loud, the doubt too consuming. Everyone wanted to know the truth. At last, the coffins were raised. Simple wooden boxes, small in size, their surfaces already damp from the soil. They were carried gently into the church, where candles flickered in the dim light. The minister led a prayer, his voice trembling. Lord, grant us courage to face what we find, and mercy to bear the burden of truth. Then the lids were pried open. The moment the first coffin was unsealed, a gasp rose from the room. It was Elias. His body, though pale and stiff, bore signs that chilled every soul present. His hands were not folded neatly as before, but clenched tight, the nails broken and torn. The soft wood of the coffin lid was scratched, scored with frantic marks. His face, once calm in death, was frozen in an expression of anguish, as though he had awakened in the dark and fought with every ounce of strength to free himself. Margaret let out a cry so piercing it seemed to split the rafters. She fell to her knees, clutching the side of the coffin, her voice breaking. "My boy, my poor boy." John pulled her back, his own face stricken, but he could not hide the tears that streamed freely down his weathered cheeks. When Samuel's coffin was opened, the horror deepened. Though smaller, his box too bore the telltale scratches inside. Dirt clung beneath his fingernails, his tiny fists locked tight. His lips were drawing back as if he had struggled for air, his body twisted in final desperation. He had not passed peacefully as they had believed. He had fought against the suffocating earth until life was gone for certain. The church fell into stunned silence. Some villagers wept openly. Others turned away, unable to look. One woman fainted, caught by her husband before she struck the ground. The minister, pale as the corpses before him, dropped his Bible to the floor. The sound of it echoed through the room, a hollow thud that seemed to mark the finality of what had been revealed. The truth was undeniable. Elias and Samuel Granger had been buried alive. For the family, the realization was worse than death itself. To know their boys had awakened in darkness, alone, trapped, calling out with no one to hear, it was a torment no parent could bear. Margaret clung to John, her body trembling with sobs that would not end. John, usually the steady oak of the family, looked broken, his strength stripped away by the unbearable weight of guilt. He whispered over and over, "God forgive us. God forgive us." The villagers, too, were shaken. Fear rippled through the community. If it had happened to the Grangers, could it not happen to anyone? How many others had been buried before their time, mistaken for dead in the fever's grip? The old stories, once told in hushed tones, now felt horribly real. The coffins were closed again, but the boys could not be returned to the earth without a second ceremony. This time, prayers were longer, the hymns heavier. The minister's voice cracked as he begged God to shelter the children's souls, to forgive human blindness, to heal wounds that could never truly be mended. When the coffins were lowered once more, Margaret nearly collapsed into the grave herself. Neighbors had to steady her, their own hands shaking as they clutched her arms. John stood rigid, staring at the earth as though it were an enemy. His lips moved in silent words, pleas, curses, or confessions. No one could tell Dot as the soil was shoveled back. The sound of each clod striking the wooden boxes rang like a drumbeat of despair. One after another, until the coffins were covered, the graves smoothed over, and the churchyard fell silent again. But the silence was not peace. It was the heavy, suffocating silence of a truth too terrible to speak aloud. Dot, from that day on, the Grangers were changed. The farmhouse that had once echoed with laughter grew hushed, its halls filled only with sorrow. Margaret spent hours staring out the window toward the churchyard, her lips moving in prayers no one could hear. John threw himself into work, plowing and harvesting with a fury that seemed less about feeding his family than punishing himself. Anna clung to her parents, sensing the shadow that had fallen over them all. Dot, and in the town, the story of the Granger boys spread like wildfire. Some called it a tragedy, others a warning, and still others whispered that the photograph taken afterward would forever carry the boys silent. Screams. Dot, in the days following the shocking discovery, the Granger household was consumed by grief that seemed to seep into every corner of the home. The boys' absence was felt in the quiet of the kitchen, the stillness of the barn, and the empty chairs where they had once played. Every object reminded Margaret and John of the lives they had lost, and yet there was one thing left to do: to create a final image of their sons, a memorial that could capture them forever, even in death. This was a practice that had grown in popularity in mid-19th century America: postmortem photography. Traveling photographers moved from town to town, offering families a chance to preserve a likeness of their loved ones. The photographs were somber, careful, and precise. Some families arranged bodies in their caskets. Others posed the deceased in chairs or standing positions, sometimes even with living relatives positioned around them. These images were meant to comfort, to memorialize, and, in a way, to reclaim the dead for the living. The Grangers hired a local photographer who had experience with such portraits. The man arrived with his bulky wooden camera, a tripod, glass plates, and chemical solutions that could capture detail with eerie clarity. Margaret guided him quietly, arranging the parlor with care. Heavy curtains were drawn to soften the afternoon light, and candles flickered to add warmth to the cold room. Every detail mattered: the boys' clothing, their hair, the small wooden chairs where they would sit side by side. Elias was placed in his chair first. Margaret's hands trembled as she adjusted his posture, ensuring that his shoulders were straight and his hands folded neatly in his lap. Samuel followed, propped gently against Elias, as if to show the inseparable bond they had shared in life. Though their eyes were closed, the photographer worked meticulously to capture a natural expression, positioning their heads slightly so that their features appeared relaxed, even peaceful. The room was silent, save for the soft scrape of wood and the occasional adjustment of clothing. Margaret's eyes were red and swollen, her heart heavy with the knowledge that she was photographing her children after they had struggled for breath beneath the earth. John stood to the side, rigid, silent, his hands clasped tightly together. Little Anna watched quietly, sensing the gravity of what was happening. Even if she did not fully understand, the shutter clicked. The camera required long exposure, so the photographer had to keep everything still for several seconds. In that stillness, the family and photographer all felt a weight that words could not carry. It was not merely a photograph. It was a testament to loss, a frozen moment of grief, and a recognition that the boys had lived and suffered beyond what should have been. The final boundary. When the plates were developed, the result was haunting. The boys appeared serene, almost asleep, but subtle details betrayed the tragic reality. The pale tint of their skin, the slight stiffness in their fingers, and the way the light caught their hair in a way that made it seem almost ethereal. To the untrained eye, it might have seemed a simple memorial. To the Grangers, it was a reminder of the horror that had taken place, and a bitter acknowledgment of what they could never undo. The photograph was framed in dark wood and placed in the parlor, where Margaret could see it each day. It was intended as a tribute, but it carried a weight far greater than any simple memento. Family members and visitors who came to the house would sometimes comment on the boys' uncanny stillness, as though they were sleeping rather than gone. The image provoked both fascination and fear, a visual representation of the boundary between life and death that had been cruelly tested. For the Grangers, the photograph became a tool of memory and repentance. They had buried their sons too soon, and while nothing could bring back what had been lost, the image allowed them to hold on in some small way. Margaret would sit for hours before it, whispering prayers and recounting memories of laughter, mischief, and love. John would glance at it as he worked, a silent reminder of the fragility of life and the terrible consequences of errors made in moments of grief and panic. In a broader sense, the photograph also became a record of the times. Mid-19th century America was marked by fragile lives, precarious health, and fears of premature burial. These images, once private, now serve as historical windows into a world where death could strike swiftly and unpredictably, and where families had to confront the unthinkable with whatever means they could muster. The Granger photograph was more than a family keepsake. It was a visual testament to human fragility, a memorial to love and loss, and a silent echo of the fear and sorrow that gripped a nation in an era when life was uncertain and death often came too soon. It captured not only the faces of two children, but the weight of grief, the bonds of family, and the haunting question that would linger in the minds of all who saw it. What price do we pay for moments lost to haste, fear, and circumstance? The photograph of Elias and Samuel Granger became more than just a family keepsake. It became a symbol, a story that rippled far beyond the walls of the Granger farmhouse. In the small village where they had lived and died, whispers of their tragedy spread quickly. Neighbors spoke of the boys' last struggle, of the horror of being buried alive, and of the haunting photograph that remained as a silent witness to what had occurred. Some villagers were horrified. fearing that such a fate could befall their own children. Others were curious, drawn to the house to glimpse the image, to see with their own eyes the pale, peaceful faces that had once been alive. The photograph, preserved carefully by Margaret, became a focal point for discussion about mortality, human error, and the fragility of life in the mid-19th century. For the Granger family, its meaning was deeply personal. The photograph allowed them to hold on to Elias and Samuel in a way that memory alone could not. In those dark, quiet hours when Margaret sat staring at the image, she would remember the boys' laughter, their arguments, their closeness, and the countless moments of joy that life had granted them before the fever took hold. The photograph was a bridge of connection to what was gone, yet still present in memory. At the same time, it was a reminder of guilt and grief. John often caught himself staring at the boys' still faces, thinking of the moments he might have acted differently, the precautions he might have taken, or the prayers he might have whispered earlier. The weight of their early burial lingered, shaping how he approached everything thereafter, from work in the fields to interaction with his surviving daughter. Anna. In broader historical context, the Granger story was emblematic of a much larger reality. Families across America lived in constant awareness of death's suddenness. Epidemics, unsafe medical practices, and the lack of modern care meant that life was fragile, particularly for children. The fear of premature burial was widespread, and post-mortem photography had grown in part as a response to that fear. Families used these images to memorialize those who had been taken too soon, to preserve their presence in a world that could be cruel and unforgiving. The photograph of the Granger boys, with its haunting combination of innocence and tragedy, also influenced local attitudes toward death. Some parents demanded longer vigils before burial, some commissioned safety coffins, and some simply held their children a little tighter at night. The story became cautionary, a whispered warning of what could happen when grief and haste overrode careful observation. Over time, the Grangers themselves sought to transform their sorrow into remembrance. Margaret recorded this story in letters and journals, carefully recounting the sequence of events, the boys' personalities, and the lessons learned from their deaths. She wanted future generations to understand not only the grief she had endured, but the humanity of mistakes made in fear and uncertainty. John, too, spoke to neighbors about the importance of patience and caution, hoping that no other family would endure the horror that had befallen theirs. Though years passed, the photograph endured. Generations later, descendants would uncover it in attics or trunks, still framed carefully by Margaret's hands. To historians and collectors, it became a remarkable artifact, not only for its visual impact, but for the story it preserved. It captured an era, a family, and the fragility of life in a way that words alone could not convey. The legacy of Elias and Samuel Granger lies both in the photograph and in the memory it preserves. It reminds us that even in ordinary households, extraordinary tragedies can occur. It speaks to the deep bonds between siblings, the relentless weight of parental love, and the haunting presence of grief that persists long after the earth has closed over the departed. In the story of the Granger family, life, death, and memory intertwine, leaving an indelible mark on both their world and ours. As we look back on the lives of Elias and Samuel Granger, it is impossible not to feel the weight of history pressing down upon us. These were ordinary children, growing up in a world defined by simple rhythms of home, church, and fieldwork. And yet, their story is extraordinary, a chilling reminder of the fragility of life and the shadows that once loomed over families in 19th century America. We are drawn to the photograph, to the frozen faces of the boys, not only because it is a record of grief, but because it captures something deeper. In the stillness of that image, we see love, loss, and the desperate human desire to hold on, even when the world has taken everything. The photograph is silent, yet it speaks, of mistakes we cannot undo, of lives interrupted too soon, and of the relentless pull of memory that keeps the departed close even when they are gone. The story of the Granger brothers asks us to confront uncomfortable questions. How do we cope with the suddenness of death? How do we reconcile our love for those lost with the limitations of human knowledge and care? In an era before modern medicine, before reliable diagnostics, families often face choices that could mean the difference between life and death. And sometimes, as in the case of Elias and Samuel, even the most careful efforts were not enough. Yet amid the sorrow, there is also a kind of reverence. The Granger story is not only a tale of tragedy, but also a testament to devotion. The parents' grief, the lengths they went to honor and remember their sons, and the photograph itself all speak to an enduring bond that death could not sever. Even centuries later, the image resonates with the same emotional force it did when first captured, a reminder of how fragile and precious life is, and how deeply love can endure. History often presents us with stark realities, moments that challenge our understanding and touch the heart in ways no textbook can. The story of Elias and Samuel Granger is one of these moments. It is a story of life interrupted, of a family's profound loss, and of the haunting legacy left behind by ordinary lives caught in extraordinary circumstances. As we reflect, we are left with a haunting question that has echoed for generations. How many lives have been silenced too soon? And what echoes remain, captured in memory, in photographs, and in the stories we dare to tell? In remembering the Granger boys, we remember the countless others whose names have been lost to time. We remember the fragile line between life and death, the weight of grief, and the resilience of the human heart. And perhaps most importantly, we are reminded to cherish every fleeting moment, for none of us knows how long the earth will allow us to remain. The photograph remains, a silent witness to history, sorrow, and love, a haunting testament to the lives of two boys who will never be forgotten.